Hello, welcome to This Day in Minnesota History, Episode 5. Today's article comes from the August 6th, 1888 edition of the Duluth Evening Herald. In 1888, our president was Grover Cleveland. We were still in the height of what was to be called later the Gilded Age. Susan B. Anthony opened an International Congress for Women's Rights in Washington, D.C. Casey at the Bat was published by Ernest Thayer, and the Washington Monument opened to the public. Today's article, entitled No More Strike, is a seemingly innocuous chronicle of the end of a sewer workers' strike, which happened over the course of the week prior. A raise from $1.50 a day to $1.75 a day is agreed upon grudgingly at Culbertson's West End Hall, what is now 22nd Avenue West and Superior Street in Duluth, just a few blocks north of the Duluth Grill. Problem solved. All is well with the world, yes? But this is only the middle of the story. In order to understand, we need to look at the beginning and at the end. After the Civil War, the United States grew at unprecedented rates. By the 1880s, we went from the fourth to the first largest industrial producing nation in the world. Before this time, factories were small, often family-run affairs where workers knew their product from start to finish, where workers had a vested interest in their work, and where workers' expertise was vital to the company and their product. But by 1880s, massive influxes of capital, infrastructure, and scale were changing the face of not only manufacturing, but also the nation and the world. The United States grew fast. It demanded both raw and manufactured goods in ever-increasing quantities. Wood, iron, steel, copper, and food were being harvested and moved on enormous scales via railroads. The industrial engine of our nation revved up. Its attitude towards labor changed as well. The Carnegies and Vanderbilts of the world needed unskilled, easily controlled labor to work for the least amount of cost possible. This, of course, evolved into the assembly line model. Duluth was central to this growth. Its port connected it to the world, and railroad tycoons dreamed of connecting it to the Pacific. Boom and bust ruled the day as projects grew, sputtered, and grew again. In fact, Duluth went through more than one of these cycles. Jay Cooke, banker and inveterate swindler, my opinion, saw Duluth as the Chicago of the West. He started the Lake, Superior, and Mississippi Railroad. He underwrote Duluth banks. He encouraged other businesses to locate to Duluth. In 1873, he went broke and crashed. And when that happened, Duluth had about 5,000 people. The next year, it had 2,500. The city even allowed its town charter to lapse and did not reincorporate as a city until 1878, when the lumber and wheat industries took off. The Northern Pacific Railroad finally did connect Duluth to the Great Plains and the Bonanza wheat farms. The harbor, completed by dredging a canal through to the sheltered side of Minnesota Point in 1871, filled with boats and barges loading up with timber and wheat. Though the first iron mines exported through what is now two harbors, the mining industry had begun and would also help to grow and shape Duluth. The harbor and bayfront sprouted grain elevators, 22 million bushels in 1886, sawmills, railroad yards, blast furnaces, metalworking shops, and docks. And people. Labor. Duluth was remote. It did not have a large supply of quote-unquote American laborers. The industries then advertised in foreign language newspapers across the country and the world, and people began to pour in. By 1870, 60% of Duluth was foreign-born, the largest contingent being Swedish. The churches started at around this time indicate the diversity. You have Danish Methodist, Swedish Church of Christ, Norwegian Methodist, First German Methodist, Finnish Evangelical Lutheran, and the St. Mary Star of the Sea Catholic Church. Business promised $2 to $4 a day. In reality, they paid on average $1.50 a day. The problem? Duluth was remote. The cost of living was high. The average cost of living in Duluth in 1880 was $702 a year. The average salary was $500 a year. Single men often lived in boarding houses. In fact, companies built their own boarding houses for their workers. Families mostly rented. Those working poor who could not afford to rent built shanties clustered around the harbor in the West End, near Rice's Point, Lincoln Park, Oneota, and the other neighborhoods in the area. Poverty was such that even the two Duluth newspapers began to write articles suggesting that the salary demands were necessary to alleviate poverty. Now, in 1888, the Knights of Labor, it started as a secret organization in Pennsylvania, but it grew into a large labor union, opened a lodge in Duluth. Workers knew the score. Throughout the summer, Duluth began construction of its sewer system in 1888. It hired a series of contractors who bid for the work, and these contractors, like Wolf and Truax from our article, hired the labor at $1.50 a day. On August 2nd, a gang of workers quit. The next day, the strike spread, with a gang of strikers going east along Superior Street, urging other men to quit. By the time the strikers reached Fitker's Brewery, there were a good 500 men in the crowd. The strikers moved further east, heading up 10th Avenue and then turning west, picking up other men who had been working on the street and sewer construction on 3rd and 4th Street. Eventually, they arrived at a vacant lot opposite the Ferguson buildings on the 400 block of West Superior Street, where speeches were made calling for $2 a day. At this meeting, a decision was made to call out the men working on the coal docks and in the sawmills on Rice's Point. The crowd moved down towards the point, picking up city streetcar crews along the way. Despite some minor violence when a sawmill engineer tried to prevent the strikers from shutting down his engine, the strikers succeeded in shutting down the coal docks and sawmills on the point. Headlines in the Lake Superior News proclaimed a strike which spreads over the city from end to end, and work is stopped. On August 6th, they reached a compromise of $1.75 a day. This satisfied neither side, really, and laid the groundwork for the end of our story. In 1889, the same companies involved in sewer work reneged on their agreement and went back to paying $1.50 a day. The laborers and their friends, members of the Knights of Labor, labor newspapers, and friendly businesses struck again. The forces arrayed form a fascinating insight into the struggle and into the change going on in Duluth. On labor's side, you have foreign-born immigrants and immigrant owners of local businesses, like men like E.G. Swanstrom. On the side of the companies, you have the American-born, the elite, the moneyed forces backed by the government, backed by largely Irish police force armed with rifles and 44s, and even Company K of the Minnesota Guard. Tensions ran high. July 5th, 1889, there was a rally and march of some 2,000 people, which was broken up by police firing into the crowd. Nobody was hurt seriously. The papers were now derisive and no longer backed labor's demands, saying that the companies couldn't afford to pay $1.75. Instead, they sided with management. On July 6th, the laborers came back, armed. They had pistols. A 1-hour gunfight ensued in the streets of Duluth. 4 people lay dead at the end of it, 3 workers and 1 innocent bystander. The police involved received gold medals for their work. The papers blamed hot-blooded Italians, anarchists, and subversives. 6 arrests were made. 1 man was tried and found not guilty. All the rest of the charges were dropped. But in the wake of this struggle, labor, especially immigrant labor, achieved a certain amount of power and recognition. 1890 saw Mayor Sutphin, who largely backed the companies, replaced by a man named M.J. Davis, who was a labor leader. New rules were put in place regarding police use of force. Things improved for a while. The roots of Duluth labor unions and the unions across the Iron Range were allowed to find themselves and establish themselves. And this held for a while, at least until the steel companies came. But that's another story, and we'll have to get to that at another article of This Day in Minnesota History. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you in a week. All right, seems only fitting that we end this little episode with a bit of Woody Guthrie, the Union Maid, based on an old fiddle tune called Red Wing. There once was a Union maid, she never was afraid of the goons and the ginks and the company finks and the deputy sheriffs who made the raid. She went to the Union Hall when a meeting it was called, and when the Legion boys come round, she always stood her ground. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union, I'm sticking to the Union, I'm sticking to the Union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union, I'm sticking to the Union till the day I die. Well, this Union maid was wise to the tricks of the company spies. She couldn't be fooled by a company stool. She'd always organize the guys. She always got her way. When she struck for better pay, she'd show her card to the National Guard, and this is what she'd say. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union, I'm sticking to the Union, I'm sticking to the Union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the Union, I'm sticking to the Union till the day I die. Oh, you gals who want to be free, just take a tip from me. Get you a man who's a Union man and join the Ladies Auxiliary. Married life ain't hard when you got a Union